In 2007, because protections worked, they came back. 7 nesting pairs remain. 7. Last year, the protections were repealed in the middle of one of the biggest erosions of the policy safety net that protects us all from short-termism. 7 pairs. That's what's left, and that's also what's at stake. And here tonight is exactly the right place to start. Hola, hello, bonjour, Anin. I'm Andrés Jiménez Monge. I'm the Executive Director of Ontario Nature. Welcome, and thank you for being here in a summer afternoon with no rain and a World Cup in a World Cup city. You are absolutely awesome. Like, when I started seeing the room fill up, I was like, oh my God, there is hope. There is hope. And today we discuss Ontario Nature's and Ecojustice's work to protect our natural world for every species that calls Ontario home. Tonight we are grateful to be in the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and Wasaga Beach. The subject of much of our discussion tonight is located upon the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people of the Three Fires Confederacy, and is part of Treaty 18, the Wasaga Purchase with Chippewas from Beausoleil, Georgina Island, and Rama. As a settler organization, we remain committed to the obligations and responsibilities of the treaties and to ensuring our work respects First Nation rights and sovereignty. I also like to always acknowledge the land. After all, it's a land acknowledgement. And I acknowledge the land by remembering that nature is everyone's right, everyone's joy, and everyone's responsibility. And for me, the best way to acknowledge the land is by expanding the opportunities for everyone to join in. Ecojustice and Ontario Nature have worked together before. In 2019, some of you might remember, I hope a lot of you remember, South Bruce Peninsula was convicted of damaging piping plover habitat in Wasaga Beach, now known as Saugeen Beach. The municipality appealed, and in 2022, the Court of Appeal upheld that conviction, which means we shouldn't be here tonight. We are here tonight. Tonight, we will explain the moment we are in, where decision makers are willing to trade decades of environmental progress for short-term gain. Or what I call short-term fear dressed up as economic courage. We'll use the piping plover as our main example, not just because they're charismatic, they are so very dapper, because they are a test case. Tony always refers to it as the litmus test. If the federal government won't enforce species at risk legislation for a bird that has already been gone once and came back because of the law working, what will they enforce it for? We'll also walk you through Ecojustice's legal challenge to Bill 5. Bill 5, as you might know, created special economic zones, areas where environmental rules don't apply. The government says they will attract investment and create jobs, and so far the only jobs it's created are for lawyers. You'll meet 2 of them tonight. Both cases, same question. Who decides what gets protected and whether the law means anything when it's inconvenient? You'll hear from Tony Morris, Ontario Nature's Conservation Policy Director with 10 years of experience in the field. Tony will explain how we got here, the piping plovers, Wasaga Beach, and the legal challenge that followed. You'll also hear from Zhao, researcher at Ecojustice. Eric will walk us through what an emergency order is. I didn't know what it was until we did one. and what the legal challenge to protect piping plovers at Wasaga Beach actually involves. And finally, Lindsay Beck from Ecojustice will provide a brief overview of the legal challenges against the Special Economic Zones Act. Lindsay brings a background in civil litigation and journalism, which for this kind of work turns out to be useful preparation. After the presentations, we'll open it up for questions. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. So as Andres said, I'm Tony Morris. I'm the Conservation Policy and Campaigns Director at Ontario Nature, and here's a brief outline of what we're going to cover tonight. So I'll start with a bit of context setting. We'll then show a video that we produced earlier this year about Wasaga Beach and the piping plovers, just to kind of get you situated. And then I'll go into a bit more about the plovers in Wasaga and how we got to this point before turning it over to Eric to explain the emergency order and the legal challenge that Ontario Nature and Environmental Defence, in collaboration with Ecojustice, are launching or have launched. And then Lindsay will, as Andres said, go into the Special Economic Zones Act, a legal challenge that Ecojustice is leading with various groups. And then I'll explain the Bill C5 legal challenge that is being led by various First Nations, just because there's a lot of legal challenges going on. There are a lot of overlap between them, just to basically provide all of that context. And then we'll have plenty of times for questions and discussion. So as Andres said, right now, the conservation movement, we face a very difficult political context. In Ontario in particular, we're seeing a provincial government that continues to systematically weaken protections for nature. More recently, the federal government has also decided to go down this path. Both are doing this with the argument that it's all under the guise of strengthening our economy. We believe this is a false narrative and ignores how dependent our way of life, our very survival as a species, is dependent on a healthy natural world. It seems strange in the midst of interrelated biodiversity and climate crises that we still have to make this argument. But political winds often shift. At the same time, our governments make arguments about sovereignty and improving our economic resilience. They ignore or forget how much nature is part of our identity, or how much of our strength as a nation comes from our abundant natural areas and plentiful wildlife. This strange contradiction where our decision makers undermine core tenets of our national identity is most evident with Bill 5. For those that need a refresher, Bill 5 was a massive and incredibly consequential omnibus bill that amended or created multiple new pieces of legislation. In addition to repealing the Endangered Species Act, it created the new Special Economic Zones Act, which you'll hear about more later. Bill 5 also exempted 2 projects from comprehensive environmental assessments, a mine in the Ring of Fire and a landfill in Dresden, southwestern Ontario. It also included changes to the Mining Act to expand ministerial powers and change the sole purpose of that act to solely focused on economic factors instead of public health, safety, and the environment like it was under the previous iteration. This is just a snapshot of some of the most significant aspects of that bill, but suffice to say, Bill 5 is a threat to healthy communities, good planning, species at risk, Indigenous rights, and democratic accountability. This bill is a perfect test case for this difficult moment we find ourselves in, and one we'll return to throughout the presentation, highlighting specifically what's happening at Wasaga Beach and the piping plovers as a case study. So now I'll show a short video about Wasaga Beach to get us situated. Assuming technology works for me. Did work before. Atlantic's most iconic shorelines. It is also known as Ontario's playground. It is a living shoreline where people and nature meet. But beneath this postcard image lies one of the rarest and most fragile ecosystems in the entire Great Lakes Basin.
A healthy beach has natural debris, uneven sand, and native vegetation. They're not flaws, but they are a natural part of the ecosystem that allow the beach to survive.
The definition of pristine is actually in its natural state, undisturbed. But we find that people assume that pristine is a perfect, quote, perfect beach with nothing but wide open expanses of raked sand. But the important thing to know about Wasaga Beach is the sand here was formed thousands and thousands of years ago. It does not replenish itself. So if it blows away, it's gone for good.
So sand reed grass and American beach grass, which are our dune-binding grass species, are able to hold sand on our beaches. The sand blows through the grass. The roots are able to hold the sand there and keep it in place. Without these dunes and this native vegetation, we eventually will lose sand from our beaches, and once it's gone, it's gone.
Wasaga Beach is the most important nesting site for endangered piping plovers in Ontario. Their return after a 30-year absence was one of Canada's greatest conservation success stories. The survival of piping plovers depends on healthy beaches with undisturbed dunes and shorelines, vegetation and driftwood, and carefully managed human activity. Wasaga is the most important site in Ontario, and when we say that, we mean about half of all the fledglings in Ontario since 2007 came from Wasaga. So it's produced half the babies ever since they came back here. And that's a really, really significant portion just from one location. It also is providing breeding birds, so adult piping plovers, to other beaches in Ontario.
Raking basically destroys the beach, currently and for the future, because it takes out all the natural elements. It doesn't allow any dunes to form. Raking also interrupts the food source for shorebirds like the piping plover. The idea of development is to try to attract more tourists, but most people actually come to Wasaga Beach for the beach. And in fact, this particular area here, a lot of people love this section of the beach because it's so natural. So my concern would be that ongoing development would end up taking away natural elements on the shoreline and natural elements on the beach itself, and we might end up with just a continuation of what one sees on the main strip.
Sand beaches and dunes are provincially rare and really significant along the Lake Huron coast, making up only about 2 to 3% of the total shoreline along the 6,000 kilometers. These locations host a variety of different habitats and staging areas for provincially significant species like the monarch butterfly, Hill's thistle, and the eastern hognose snake. Without these spots, these species might cease to exist.
Wasaga Beach can continue to be a beloved destination and a thriving ecosystem, but only if we protect the dunes, embrace the natural shoreline, and respect the species that call this place home. If you'd like to share that video, check it out on Ontario Nature's YouTube channel. Very proud of that piece of work. So as the video said, Wasaga Beach is a global treasure. It is a natural living shoreline and has for years balanced tourism and ecological integrity. When it was a provincial park, it was the most visited provincial park in the province because of the beach. And as the video said, freshwater sand dunes are globally rare, with only 2 to 3% of the Lake Huron shoreline being dune ecosystems. These dunes provide numerous ecological benefits as well as stabilize the beach. They replenish the sand on the beach. That sand is not a renewable resource. Once it's gone, it's gone. They protect the town from storm surges and high water levels, and the vegetation communities are necessary to keep that sand in place while providing habitat for species like the plovers. So as the video said, since 2008, Wasaga Beach has been the site of 59 piping plover nests, which produced a total of 87 fledglings. That's nearly half of all the fledglings in Ontario. These young plovers go on to breed at other sites across Ontario. In fact, a third of Ontario's breeding piping plover population came from Wasaga Beach. Wasaga's plovers fuel the population across the Great Lakes, nesting at Darlington and Presqu'île provincial parks, and even establishing new and historic sites at some of the neighboring Great Lakes states. This is a success story and demonstrates that nesting habitat at Wasaga Beach is of high quality. The balance between ecological protection and tourism has been working. Habitat like this is hard to come by on the Great Lakes. Natural beaches with a mix of vegetation, dunes, and natural debris, all necessary for plovers to find food and shelter, are rare. Throughout Ontario, these areas have been lost to mechanical beach grooming, developments, and shoreline hardening. If plovers lose their home at Wasaga Beach, they have very few other places to go. So as Andrés said on the top, I like to talk about plovers as a litmus test. They really are a litmus test of the strength of the Species at Risk Act to make up for those lost provincial protections. Their success at Wasaga Beach indicates a healthy ecosystem that balances different uses effectively. Disturbing that balance could lead to their disappearance again, impacting complex ecosystem processes. I've used this analogy before, including at testimony against Bill 5, and it's fitting, but the plovers are just one species in a Jenga tower. The more pieces you pull from that tower, the more unstable it becomes. That is why protecting species at risk is vital, and why Ontario Nature and Environmental Defence, alongside Ecojustice, launched a lawsuit for an emergency order to protect these charismatic birds and their habitat at Wasaga Beach. Now I'll explain how we actually got to this point of that lawsuit. So, as many of you might know, last June, the Government of Ontario passed Bill 5, which, as I mentioned, included a proposal to repeal the Endangered Species Act, replacing it with the far weaker Species Conservation Act. Also last June, they posted a proposal to remove several parcels of land from Wasaga Beach Provincial Park, most significantly 4 of the 8 beach areas which happen to be the most important plover habitat at Wasaga Beach. Then in November of last year, the province passed Bill 68. That's the bill that formally removed those lands from the protections under the Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act. This was despite both Bill 5 and that Wasaga Beach proposal being widely opposed. For the Wasaga Beach proposal, over 98% of the public comments were in opposition. 98%. And the government proceeded to move forward regardless. In March of this year, the Species Conservation Act came into effect, formally repealing the Endangered Species Act, which was once considered the gold standard of species at risk protections in Canada. If you can believe it, back in 2007, when the Endangered Species Act was passed, it was passed with the support of all provincial political parties, something that is probably unthinkable these days. The new Species Conservation Act removes provincial protections for 106 species, including all migratory birds like the piping plover and aquatic species. The province claims these protections are duplicative with the federal government's Species at Risk Act. but this is incredibly misleading. In August of last year, Ontario Nature, along with 12 other organizations, sent a letter to the federal minister requesting a critical habitat order under the Species at Risk Act to protect the piping plover habitat across Ontario. This letter identified that critical habitat had been identified at multiple sites by the federal government back in 2013. We argued a critical habitat order is necessary because the province was getting rid of the Endangered Species Act and removing provincial park protections from Wasaga Beach, which, as we know, later happened. The provincial recovery strategy under the former Endangered Species Act also recommended a habitat regulation back in 2013, but no regulation was ever issued. It wasn't until October of 2025 that we received a response from Environment Climate Change Canada, not from the Minister of her staff, but from an Assistant Deputy Minister. That response did not confirm whether the government would issue a critical habitat order. It said just that they remained committed to the Accord for the Protection of Species at Risk, and that they were advancing work on the protection of critical habitat for all migratory birds. At the same time, the town of Wasaga Beach continued to advance planning for Destination Wasaga, a plan which includes components that would damage or destroy habitat for piping plover. They also made public comments on potentially raking the beach in areas of that critical habitat. The last several months has seen the town change its approach due to public pressure and at least publicly recognize the importance of piping plover habitat. But that doesn't change the need for stronger protections. So I've covered most of this already, but thought it would be helpful to see a timeline of key events from June 2025 to the launch of legal challenge in April of this year. In addition to these events, we also proposed a stewardship agreement and conservation easement to the town of Wasaga Beach back in February as a means to address the concerns with the protection of the habitat. The town never agreed to those proposals. So we need the federal government to exercise its authority under Species at Risk Act and ensure species in Ontario are still protected since the provincial government has abdicated its responsibilities. The minister's failure to act, even with all the evidence provided by our various groups, necessitates the legal action that we're taking. Provincial regressions on nature protection led to this point, and now it is important that the federal government remain committed to the international biodiversity targets as it claims it is. I'll now turn it over to Eric to explain the emergency order and the mechanics of the legal challenge.
Thanks, Tony. My name is Eric. I work at Ecojustice as a researcher, and I'll speak a bit about the piping plover legal case. So I'll talk about three main topics. So first, I'll give some context on what an emergency order is, just to explain what it is that we're actually seeking in the lawsuit and why. Then second, I'll talk about kind of the process of bringing together this legal challenge in partnership with Ontario Nature, as well as with environmental defense and other experts and volunteers working on the ground at Wasaga Beach. And then third, I'll talk about developments since launching the case and where things are at today. So starting with what an emergency order is. So essentially an emergency order is a tool that's available under Section 80 of the Federal Species at Risk Act, or SARA for short, to address urgent situations that threaten an endangered species. Basically, Section 80 says that in certain situations, Julie DeBrusen, as our federal minister of the Environment, Climate Change, and Nature, must recommend that Cabinet adopt an emergency order, which is a type of regulation to protect an endangered species or its habitat. The legal test in SARA is that Minister DeBrusen must recommend an emergency order if she finds that an endangered species faces imminent threats to its survival or recovery. And then if Cabinet adopts the emergency order on her recommendation, the federal government has the power, even on non-federal lands, to identify habitat that needs to be protected for a species survival or recovery, require activities to protect that species, and prohibit activities that negatively affect that species and its habitat. So the crux of this legal case is that it's being brought to enforce Section 80 of SARA and have a court order that Minister de Bruijn is legally required to recommend an emergency order, and that her failure to act on imminent threats to the piping plover at Wasaga Beach have been unreasonable and have violated SARA. So quickly just comparing what an emergency order is with a critical habitat order, which Tony mentioned is something that Ontario Nature had also requested. A critical habitat order is another tool available under SARA, and it's meant to provide longer-term protections. It's not only triggered by emerging or new threats, but typically the way that a critical habitat order will work is that Minister de Bruijn would have been required to recommend that Cabinet adopt a critical habitat order that has similar protections for the habitat needed for piping plovers in Ontario, and that's supposed to happen within 180 days of an action plan under the Species at Risk Act. But this process was stalled for the piping plover in Ontario, and a critical habitat order never got finalized, even though an action plan was published in 2013, 13 years ago. And so since there's no critical habitat order in place to provide those longer-term protections, what that means is that when Ontario repealed the Endangered Species Act, that left a loophole or a gap in the law where there wasn't protection for piping plovers at any level of government. That means that now an emergency order as an urgent, quick tool is necessary to respond to imminent threats at Wasaga Beach and close that gap in protection, which is why we're seeking it now in this lawsuit. So why is there actually an emergency, and what are the imminent threats we're talking about? So there are essentially three different types of imminent threats at Wasaga Beach that we raised in this lawsuit that were triggered by the provincial legislative changes that Tony discussed earlier, with Bill 5 repealing the Endangered Species Act and its protections for migratory birds, and then Ontario removing areas of Wasaga Beach from the provincial park to transfer it to the town. So these three different types of threats are, first, mechanical beach raking, which is a form of beach maintenance that's done by the town. Second is construction projects that are planned on the town on or around piping plover habitat. And third, different disruptive activities by tourists and visitors that the town hosts at Wasaga Beach. So I'll briefly talk about each one of these. So first, in terms of mechanical raking, you got a bit of a preview of this in the video earlier, but essentially this is a type of method for grooming or maintaining beaches that are used for recreation or used by visitors. And beaches can often be maintained in a lot of different ways. In ecologically sensitive areas, this type of grooming might be done manually, for example, by having trained staff remove garbage or waste on the beach left by visitors by hand. But mechanical raking is an alternative method of doing that. Often for convenience, property managers may instead use this specialized machine called a rake that is dragged by a tractor. As you can see in the photo on the right, under the machine there are hundreds of steel fork-like tines that drag through the sand, and what they do is they lift up and filter and clear any debris that's left on the beach to just strip the surface. And they also flatten the sand area and leave like a nice trail that you can see in the photo behind there for visitors who might then come to the beach. And just to recap a bit why that's so harmful for piping plover habitat, as you heard in the video, piping plovers rely on an undisturbed natural beach surface for several reasons. One of those is that when piping plovers return from their annual migration, traveling so far from often like the Gulf of Mexico and areas in the southern United States, what they do is they come to freshwater beaches in Ontario and they build their nests by digging these shallow depressions in the sand, and then they'll travel across the beach surface, gathering different forms of natural debris like stones or shells or driftwood, and they'll line their nests with those debris because they need to provide camouflage from predators. You'll have seen in the photo from a few slides back that piping plover eggs are camouflaged perfectly among natural debris like stones and shells on the beach. And so that's really essential for their survival, that they can have that natural debris to be able to nest and raise their young. They also rely on sand dunes, which provide natural barriers to protect their nests and protect their chicks from flooding and harsh weather. And they also often forage for food among beach wrack, which is essentially seaweed and organic material that's deposited on the shore of beaches, and that can also get cleared by mechanical raking. So the problem with mechanical raking is that it just does a mass clearing of all of this type of debris that piping plovers need for all different types of life processes, including including nesting, breeding, and foraging for food. And in August 2025, the town of Wasaga Beach confirmed on their social media that they bought a new mechanical raking machine and already started using it on other beach areas that had been removed from the provincial park. And so we were concerned that they could do that on piping plover habitat now that it was no longer protected by any provincial laws. And you'll see the picture on the left is the photo that the town posted on their own social media showing the raking machine in use. So the second main type of imminent threat facing piping plovers is the town's planned construction projects. So some of you may be familiar with or have heard of Destination Wasaga. This is a campaign that was announced by the town in partnership with Ontario in May 2025 to redevelop the downtown area of Wasaga Beach around Beach Area 1 to boost tourism, including various construction projects on the main beach area that's used by piping plovers for nesting starting this year. So just to give one example, there's a lot of different types of construction projects that are all included within this campaign. But one example is just this pedestrian bridge project, which is a proposed bridge that would connect from New Wasaga Beach to Beach Area 1, an area that's used predominantly for piping plover nesting. And as described, that type of project would seem to direct tourists right into a historic nesting site for piping plovers. And then the third type of imminent threat that was triggered by the repeal of these provincial laws was various types of disruptive activities by beach tourists and visitors that are hosted by the town each year. So Wasaga Beach has over 2 million visitors each year, and there are various recreational activities that can also either damage nesting sites or disturb piping plover breeding if they aren't restricted or managed in a careful way by provincial laws. So some of those include the use of motor vehicles, so for example driving ATVs across the beach that can often flatten sand or trample over grasses and vegetation that piping plovers rely on. Things like using fireworks, kites, drones, or walking off-leash dogs. Those can often scare birds or make them think that there are predators around and cause them to abandon their nesting sites. And things like cooking or leaving food on the beach that can attract predators like foxes, raccoons, or larger birds like gulls that can then prey on piping plovers or their eggs. So these activities can really prevent successful nesting and breeding on Wasaga Beach. And as Tony explained, this area of Wasaga Beach that piping plovers nest on is really critical to the species' survival and recovery all across the province. There aren't a lot of areas left for these birds to go if Wasaga Beach is no longer a viable habitat. And so the focus of the legal challenge is that these imminent threats all require an emergency order because previously they were kept in balance and managed by provincial laws, but are no longer being restricted. So now I'll talk a little bit about what actually goes into forming this legal challenge. And a lot of collaboration went into putting together this legal case. So starting from the inception of the case, before filing a case in court, often what you need to do is you need to submit a formal demand or a petition to the government that requests that they take action to try and resolve the problem first before you take them to court. And so often that looks like preparing a pretty big research package, explaining what the issue is, why the government is legally obligated to act, and demanding that they take action. So on behalf of Ontario Nature and Environmental Defence, Ecojustice sent a petition to Minister de Brusen requesting an emergency order to protect piping plover habitat on Wasaga Beach in January 2026. To prepare that petition, we worked together with Ontario Nature, Environmental Defence, and various scientific experts to review all the evidence of historic nesting activity at Wasaga Beach and really develop our request of which areas need to be protected and using what restrictions. So on the slides, here's a map how Wasaga Beach is actually set up. So like Tony mentioned, a number of areas were specifically removed from the provincial park and set to be transferred to the town of Wasaga Beach. Wasaga Beach is actually the world's largest freshwater beach, and so it's split up into these 8 different sections, and they transferred these 4 northern sections that are circled on the slides to the town. But the section that is really essential for piping plover nesting is this area called Beach Area 1, which is where the vast majority of piping plover nests have been found. And it's in a specific subsection or specific area of Beach Area 1 that really matters for piping plover nesting. And looking through the historic data of where piping plovers choose to nest, that was the area that we demanded needed protection. So Just to step back a bit, the request in both the petition and in the lawsuit is not to prohibit the town or tourists from using all of Wasaga Beach. We're focusing specifically on a precise and tailored and evidence-based area that's needed for piping plover nesting and breeding. It's a fraction of Beach Area 1, which is itself just one of 8 areas of Wasaga Beach. So the request is to prohibit specific activities that are known to damage habitat features and interfere with nesting, as discussed earlier, in that area of Beach Area 1. And here's a bit of the timeline of taking things from the petition to Minister DeBrusen to the lawsuit. And there was a lot of work with gathering evidence with the help of volunteers on the ground. So after submitting the petition requesting the emergency order to Minister DeBrusen, we continued to follow up with Minister DeBrusen's office throughout February to April to continue to provide updates on the urgent situation, including when the Endangered Species Act was formally replaced with the Species Conservation Act in March. But before filing a lawsuit, we also needed more concrete evidence that the imminent threats had really begun to materialize at Wasaga Beach. Our petition had identified various threats that were forthcoming, like the planned construction projects, but we hadn't yet received evidence confirming that habitat damage was occurring or about to occur. And something that was extremely helpful in pushing the lawsuit forward was that Ontario Nature had been working to help train and coordinate volunteers at Wasaga Beach to document conditions on the beach and essentially be our eyes and ears on the ground, telling us what was happening at Wasaga Beach, if there were any new nests, if there were any evidence of habitat damage done by either the town or other visitors. And on April 13th is when we received concrete evidence that habitat damage was occurring, when volunteers who had been working with Ontario Nature shared photos of mechanical raking and motor vehicle tracks in parts of Beach Area 1 that were used historically for piping plover nesting. And so you see on the slides, these are some of the photos that volunteers took, just showing that pattern of raking across the beach, where those hundreds of steel tines have been dragged through and have filtered through the beach surface. And so within 3 days, on April 16th, that's when we notified Minister DeBrusen's office and then filed the pleadings for the lawsuit in the federal court, moving forward with this evidence that habitat damage was occurring. And so having that partnership with Ontario Nature and volunteers at Wasaga Beach and supporters who were really invested in the issue was critical for gathering the evidence that allowed us to proceed and move toward litigation. So now I'll talk about some of the developments since the case launch and where things are today. So first, with the response from the federal government. So some things that have happened since filing the lawsuit are that the federal government has confirmed that it is actually conducting an imminent threat assessment at Wasaga Beach. This is a process where Environmental and Climate Change Canada researches and studies the issue and then determines whether they believe there are imminent threats to the piping plover at Wasaga Beach, as required by SARA. And then if Minister DeBrusen concludes that there is an imminent threat, then she's required to recommend that Cabinet adopt an emergency order. And so Minister DeBrusen's decision is still pending today. And as we'll discuss throughout this evening, public pressure on Minister DeBrusen's office is really critical for moving the needle and encouraging her to take action and understanding that this issue matters to Ontarians. So in terms of the response from the town of Wasaga Beach, so 1 week after the lawsuit was filed, the town actually published their own press release admitting that they had mistakenly raked in piping plover habitat. And so they stated that they would add fencing to protect the area and provide new instructions to staff. And then 1 month afterward, the town adopted a new beach bylaw on May 14th. And so this really shows that the town was responding to some of the public outcry and the public pressure that supporters and partners had raised. And in terms of the beach bylaw, I'll talk about this in a moment, but this is something that was a good start. It prohibits certain destructive activities like motor vehicle use, and it's backed up by some fines, but it has a couple of key flaws in our view that still need to be addressed. So some of the main flaws with the town's beach bylaw that still need to be addressed are, first, there's a blanket exemption for the town's staff. So even though it, on its face, prohibits a lot of the activities like motor vehicle use, there's actually a section at the end, 14.2, that says that the provisions of this bylaw shall not apply to any of the town's own staff and officers. So second, there's also exemptions available for anyone else who isn't the town. And these are available because section 14.1 says, well, any person can also apply for an exemption to the town, and there aren't any criteria in the bylaw that explain when an exemption can be granted or limiting the town's discretion in giving anyone a free pass to violate the bylaw. There are also specific exemptions in the bylaw for certain activities through things called work permits, which are available for using motor vehicles or construction, and there are also special events permits that are discussed in the bylaw available for using fireworks. So these are all different ways that even like third parties or visitors could potentially get around the bylaw with the town's permission. And finally, the bylaw also describes enforcement using terms that are optional or discretionary. Essentially, they say the provisions of this bylaw may be enforced by an officer, but there's nothing guaranteeing that if a violation occurs, it will actually be prevented. And this is something that we saw as unusual because it differs from some of the town's other bylaws. For example, it differs from the town's parking bylaw, which says that it applies to all people, including the town staff. It says that no person shall park a vehicle in any of the following places, with no exemptions for the town's employees. Similarly, it's different from how the town has set out rules for all-terrain vehicles, where the provisions of that bylaw shall be enforceable by officers, and a failure to stop your ATV on Wasaga Beach in certain areas shall be an offense. So the way that the town has drafted the beach bylaw to protect piping plovers doesn't match the kind of protection that they've given to parking issues or ATV-related offenses. So the bottom line is that we've informed the town legal team about these issues and are awaiting a response. But given the various exemptions for both the town staff and for anyone else visiting the beach, the bylaw doesn't offer the same level of binding protection that an emergency order by the federal government would offer. So while this bylaw does show that the town is at least concerned about responding to the public reaction and pressure, there still is an emergency that hasn't been addressed that needs a federal emergency order. So in terms of the status of the case today, the legal case is now awaiting a hearing date from the federal court. When that hearing date happens, the federal court would have the power to mandate that Minister DeBrusen recommend the emergency order. The federal court could also declare that her delay and her failure to do so already is unreasonable and violates the Species at Risk Act. But before a court hearing happens, Minister DeBrusen also could act now. So without needing to court, she could find that the piping plover faces imminent threats to its recovery and survival at Wasaga Beach, and then recommend that Cabinet adopt an emergency order on her own. And so here's where any additional public pressure and support can really help and is key on this issue, to show that constituents care about this issue and about protecting Ontario's biodiversity, to encourage Minister DeBrusen to assess these threats quickly and reach the conclusion that an emergency order is needed before it's too late. So now I'll pass things over to Lindsay to talk about some of our other work related to Bill 5 on the Special Economic Zones Act.
Thank you, Eric. So as Eric mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about the Special Economic Zones Act. This isn't as compelling a tale as one of a critically endangered shorebird, but it is nonetheless important because of the wide-reaching implications of this act and because of its threat to rule of law and democracy in the province. So as Tony mentioned at the outset, in addition to repealing the Endangered Species Act and among other legislative reforms that were introduced or legislative changes that were introduced with Bill 5, one of the major elements of that bill last spring of 2025, was the introduction of this new piece of legislation, the Special Economic Zones Act. And this act is unique in that, unlike most laws, it doesn't have the regulation of a particular sector at its core. So most acts have a purpose, like the Mining Act regulates the mining sector in Ontario. The Endangered Species Act has as its core the aim of protecting species at risk. The only thing that this piece of legislation does is enable the creation of special economic zones. These can be any part of Ontario, of any size, and then within them designate certain projects and proponents and allow them to be exempt from the laws that apply to everyone else. So once designated, the executive branch of government, which is cabinet, can exempt these projects from the requirements of any other act that would have applied, or it can modify the application of any law that otherwise would apply. And when I say law, I don't just mean the provisions of an act. It extends to any regulation made under an act, and it extends to overriding municipal bylaws. So this, pursuant to the terms of the Act, these modifications or exemptions are to be done pursuant to what the Act calls prescribed criteria. So those criteria were established in a regulation that came into force at the start of this year. But those criteria, rather than setting some parameters around these exercises of ministerial discretion, are also all entirely in the opinion of the minister. And so where that leaves us is that there is no transparent or objective criteria to guide these exercises of ministerial discretion, to put parameters around when these exemptions or favors might be granted to one company over another and why. There's also no public process entailed in any of these designations. There's no public registry to list them, and there's no public consultation required. Most importantly, there's no legislative debate. These designations are made by cabinet ministers. Cabinet meets behind closed doors, and that's in contrast to the legislative process, which is an open one. So the issue from an environmental point of view is obvious. Cabinet can draw a boundary on a map, pick projects within it, and then decide that the rules, including safeguards that the public relies on, don't apply. So a mine proponent, a highway proponent, a hydropower project, any of these can be exempt from legislative requirements. That could mean a take water permit, a permit under the Species Conservation Act that might otherwise be required. The Mining Act requires closure plans and financial assurance before mining may go ahead. All of those could be exempt for certain projects, again, with no objective criteria around when or why. It extends beyond environmental regulations, of course, to any law in Ontario: occupational health and safety legislation, labor laws. No legislation is off limits, and there are no carve-outs. There are also obvious and clear issues from an Indigenous rights perspective. So among other things, the Act provides no means of ensuring Indigenous consultation, let alone consent. And Tony will speak more to this in a few moments. So how this legislation could be challenged legally was a very thorny question. The key provisions of the Special Economic Zones Act on this slide are what are known as Henry VIII clauses. So this is kind of a term that's used in the legal community, named, of course, for the king who was fond of bypassing Parliament and ruling by proclamation. So usually, regulations made under an act, they're rules made pursuant to legislation that spell out how an act is to be enforced or flesh out its technical details. But a Henry VIII clause is a clause in legislation that allows for regulations that don't simply put meat on the bones of the enabling statute, but allow the executive branch of government, so cabinet ministers, to actually amend it. And courts have wrestled over the years with whether this is lawful. Is it okay for cabinet to make regulations that change the content of legislation? And by and large, courts have accepted that this is okay, that it's lawful. Even broad delegations of power to the executive to amend laws are okay, so long as they don't abdicate the legislative role. And that's been seen as lawful essentially because it's within the legislature's purview to delegate. They can delegate to the executive branch because then they could take back that delegation. It's still part of the legislative process. As you can see from the quote on the screen, though, there are members of the judiciary who have expressed over the years in various cases discomfort with it. This is a quote from Justice Cote in a very powerful dissent that she wrote in the Supreme Court's decision on the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act reference. And so, regardless of this sort of tenuous place in law for these Henry VIII clauses and this type of delegation, we needed to develop a legal theory that made it a challenge to the Act distinguishable from this line of cases that accepts that delegation to the executive branch is lawful. And so the distinction we say that makes the Special Economic Zones Act unlawful is that it doesn't just allow Cabinet to amend the one enabling statute. It empowers Cabinet to amend any statute, any law across the statute book. And its sole purpose is to enable those amendments, to enable Cabinet to reach into any duly passed laws across the province and change it, pursuant to no objective criteria. And so our legal argument is that this goes beyond what delegation is. It, in fact, abdicates. It's an abdication of the legislative role. It effectively lets Cabinet make laws. And this is contrary to the Constitution, because what Section 92 of the Constitution Act says is that in each province, it's the legislature that may exclusively make laws in relation to matters coming within provincial jurisdiction. And so that's the nub of the legal theory, that this contravenes Section 92 of the Constitution Act because it creates a system whereby Cabinet is effectively becoming the lawmaker behind closed doors, as opposed to the legislature in the public, open legislative process. This also creates an obvious rule of law problem. Laws are designed to create predictable legal rules applied equally to everyone. And so that will be a part of the legal theory as well, this problem for the rule of law that this executive type of power creates. So we've brought together a client coalition and are challenging the constitutionality of this law on behalf of a group comprised of Environmental Defence, Democracy Watch, Friends of the Earth Canada, and Wildlands League. The case was launched in April of this year. We'll be in court in July simply to set a schedule and a timetable of events. And then we hope that the case can be heard early in the new year, of course, subject to court availability and whatever else may happen in the interim. So those are our clients on the case, but the broader coalition that's been galvanized by Bill 5 remains very much part of the conversation on these special economic zones, on the Special Economic Zones Act and on Bill 5 more broadly. So for example, there may be potential interveners that step up as part of the case. There is the separate First Nations-led challenge that Tony will speak to in a moment. And then there's the question of whether a broader coalition can be galvanized beyond First Nations, environmental groups, some of the folks in this room. So for example, this creates a lot of questions among the private sector that I've heard whispers of, but no loud voices around. It creates the need for behind closed doors lobbying for the private sector. One mining proponent may never know if their competitor's project may be granted the favor of a special economic zone exemption over another. There's no transparency as to how and why. So in addition to what we say are the constitutional defects with this law, the rule of law problems, the dangers for the environment, it's bad for business, it's bad for market competition, and it's bad for the rule of law. And so that's one illustration of why, beyond the legal case, it's really important to maintain public awareness of this Special Economic Zones Act and pressure on the Act. with enough public pressure, the hope is that regardless of how long the court case takes or its outcome, that public pressure can make it too toxic to use. And that can be as or more effective than any court ruling. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Tony to speak to the First Nations-led challenge to the Act.
So there's also a separate Indigenous-led challenge against both Bill 5 and Bill C5, which is a similar piece of federal legislation that was also passed last June. That bill, the federal one, has many similarities to the provincial Bill 5 in that it allows cabinet to designate projects of national interest that could be exempted from many key federal pieces of legislation, including many environmental pieces of legislation like the Fisheries Act and Species at Risk Act. The challenge launched last year by Woodward & Company, that's a law firm that's representing 14 First Nations, argues that Bill 5 and the federal Bill C5, the numbers are a complete coincidence, are unconstitutional and violate treaty rights due to provisions in the bill that limit the ability of the Crown to meaningfully fulfill its duty to consult, which is a constitutional right. Specifically, it argues that the bill are contrary to the honor of the Crown, set back reconciliation, and violate Sections 7 and 15 of the Charter. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada is a signatory to, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which is a federal act to enable that declaration, which Canada is a signatory to. So, Legal Advocates for Nature's Defence, LAND, is an intervener in this case on behalf of grassroots Indigenous land protectors from Treaty 9 in Ontario, and Ontario Nature is providing financial support for that intervention. So that intervention focuses on 3 core points: reconciliation and Indigenous natural law in the spirit and intent of Treaty 9 requires the duty by the government to protect land and water for future generations. They also argue that UNDRIP, which I mentioned, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada is a signatory to, must be meaningfully implemented at the provincial level. And that they also argue that Bill 5 perpetuates environmental racism by enabling harmful development in Indigenous homelands without their consent. So the process for this legal challenge is an application to the court. What that means is evidence is provided in written format, avoiding a long, drawn-out trial. The exact timeline is a bit difficult to predict because it's largely paper-based process. It should move faster. And as you've seen tonight, the courts are pretty backed up. A case management conference is scheduled for the end of September to discuss an application date and an intervener motion timetable. So we'll likely know more after that. If you'd like to learn more about this legal challenge, on March 3rd, Ontario Nature hosted a webinar with senior counsel from Woodward & Company, Carrie, the founder of LAND, and 2 of the Indigenous grassroots interveners to explain this legal challenge. The recording of that webinar is available on Ontario Nature's YouTube channel. So I encourage you to check it out. So we're almost done, and then we'll get to questions. How can you help? It's important to remember that legal processes can be slow and unpredictable. In the meantime, do not underestimate the power of continued political pressure. We've all kind of spoken to this, but it's important to reiterate. Both provincial and federal governments are flooding the zone right now, where they inundate us with so much at once that it's hard to keep up. The 24-hour news cycle also doesn't really help. But ultimately, decision makers are elected officials and respond to shifts in voter mood. So if enough of us are regularly and continually engaging them on the importance of nature and protecting its species at risk, they will listen. This means moving beyond form letter emails to calling, visiting their offices, Be respectful, but let them know you want better solutions and that you want nature protected and restored. You can also attend or organize events and rallies. Ontario Nature and Ecojustice both have great resources on our websites and social media to help you. So share these resources widely, engage your family, your friends, your neighbors, colleagues, your entire network. I know it's tempting to disengage and that direct action can feel intimidating, but this moment calls for collective action. We need everyone exerting pressure. It was public campaigns that led to the creation of the Endangered Species Act in the first place. It was public campaigns that pushed back against the Greenbelt land grab. So we need to use every tool at our disposal, including the courts, to safeguard the nature we all love and depend on. So please join us. And now, with that, we'll turn it over for questions.